Picture this. You're walking through the bustling streets of 17th century Paris. The air smells faintly of lavender, orange blossom, and something less pleasant. Men and women glide past, heads held high beneath towering mounds of powdered hair. These weren't just eccentric fashion choices. They were statements, they were shields, they were secrets. And believe it or not, beneath those wigs lies a history soaked in disease, deception, royal drama, and the desperate fight to keep up appearances in a world where one's image could mean everything. This is not just a tale of hair and powder, it's the story of how a mysterious illness helped launch one of the strangest, most elaborate fashion crazes in Western history, and how the humble wig once held the power to define an empire. For more than 100 years, it was virtually unthinkable for a European gentleman, especially among the nobility, to be seen in public without a powdered wig crowning his head. These wigs, sometimes grand enough to scrape the tops of carriages, were more than just decoration. They were deeply tied to status, politics, medicine, and a slowly unraveling mystery. And while they've become something of a quirky historical footnote today, in their time they were everything. The rise of the powdered wig was, oddly enough, tied to one of the most feared and misunderstood diseases in history: syphilis. In the late 15th century, a wave of panic spread through Europe as syphilis made its brutal debut. With no antibiotics, no modern medicine, and little understanding of how infections worked, the disease took on a mythic, terrifying presence. Early symptoms were subtle, just a few sores, a rash here or there. But as it progressed, syphilis devastated the body. Flesh deteriorated, limbs withered, noses collapsed, and yes, hair fell out in patches, leaving victims disfigured and socially doomed. In a world where appearance meant power, these symptoms weren't just painful, they were catastrophic. In the lavish courts and tightly ordered societies of 17th century Europe, appearances weren't just important, they were everything. Beauty and grooming were signs of status, discipline, wealth, and even moral character. And of all the physical traits one could possess, none were more prized or more politicized than a full head of long, luxurious hair. Long hair was more than a trend. For both men and women, it was a symbol of vitality, nobility, and divine favor. It whispered of wealth, of time spent in salons and under the hands of expert stylists. Hair was a walking billboard of social class, and the longer, cleaner, and better styled it was, the more powerful the message it sent. So when illness, especially something as feared and scandalous as syphilis, began to strip that symbol away, the consequences weren't just personal, they were publicly devastating. Hair loss wasn't interpreted as a minor side effect or an unfortunate accident of health. It was often seen as a mark of moral failing or proof of scandal. A balding head could spark rumors of promiscuity, poverty, or disease. For the noble class, whose identity was intricately tied to their appearance, losing one's hair was akin to losing one's standing in the social hierarchy. The shame was so intense that people often went to great lengths to hide their condition. Open discussion of illness was rare, especially when it involved anything remotely connected to sexuality. Instead of revealing their suffering, people turned to subterfuge. And so a solution emerged, not from a medical breakthrough, but from a craftsmanship revolution. Men began concealing their patchy scalps with ornate hairpieces. Women enhanced thinning locks with padded curls, weaves, and add-ons. But what began as a subtle cover-up soon grew into something far more extravagant and culturally transformative. Wigs weren't born from vanity. They were born from a desperate need to hide, and in doing so, they changed the face of fashion. Of course, no trend truly dominates until it gains royal approval, and in this case it came from one of history's most image-obsessed monarchs. King Louis XIV of France, later dubbed the Sun King, was not just a ruler. He was a living symbol of French majesty. From his lavish palace at Versailles to the golden rays that adorned his portraits, everything about Louis was curated to radiate power, youth, and immortality. So when he began losing his hair as a teenager, the young king faced a very serious problem. Boldness did not fit with the myth he was crafting, and so Louis did what few could afford. He built a new identity, one strand at a time. He hired an army of personal wig makers, up to 48 of them at one point, to design headpieces that concealed his hair loss while reinforcing the grandeur of his image. These weren't ordinary wigs. They were monuments of hair, towering and dramatic, crafted to extend his silhouette and exaggerate his royal presence. Each wig was like a crown, only larger, more versatile, and even more telling of status. As with all things in fashion, the king's choices sparked an immediate cascade effect. Within a short time, every man of noble birth was donning wigs in the royal style, trying to mimic Louis's majesty. It wasn't just about looking fashionable. It was about aligning oneself with power. To reject the wig was to reject court culture. And so the perruque, the formal name for these wigs, became mandatory attire at royal gatherings, social events, and political meetings. But beneath the powdered, curl-sand ornate flourishes, wigs had a darker, more practical role. They were masks carefully constructed to hide what was considered unspeakable. A finely made wig could conceal more than just thinning hair. It could cover oozing sores, blotchy skin, or lumpy scars left behind by diseases like syphilis or smallpox. They were shields against judgment, whispering elegance where nature had spoken of illness and lice. Yes, lice were everywhere. With personal hygiene limited and combs far from sterilized, head lice were a common nuisance. But wigs presented a strange sort of solution. Since people shaved their heads underneath their wigs, it was easier to boil the wig rather than try to delouse natural hair. Wigmaker 7 developed techniques to clean, treat, and repowder wigs, giving them a fresh scent and new life. It was like a strange spa day for your hairpiece. The wigs themselves became increasingly elaborate, and the powder used to whiten them became a trend all its own. Most people today think of powdered wigs as simply white, but the reality was much more colorful, especially for women. Powdered violet, blue-gray, and even pastel pinks became popular among the upper class, sometimes reflecting personal style or seasonal fashion. And let's not forget the ingredients. Powder wasn't just for show, it was functional. It masked odor, added volume, and helped maintain the wig's shape. Some used rice powder, others starch or talcum, and still others went as far as to use chalk or plaster of Paris. Not exactly gentle on the scalp. Still, the scent was what truly sold it. Powders were often mixed with lavender, rose, or citrus oils, lending a refined aroma that helped cover the, shall we say, musk of Thera. In a world before deodorant, scented hair was a luxury of near magical appeal. And the result? A society where almost everyone, man, woman, noble, or commoner, wore some form of false hair. But the grander the wig, the more convincing the illusion. From kings to commoners, wigs took over Europe. But not all wigs were created equal. The term bigwig comes from this very era, used to describe someone important enough to afford the largest, most extravagant wig possible. It was a literal flex. The taller the hair, the higher your status. Wigs became so integral to society that by the late 1600s, France established a wig makers guild to regulate the booming industry. By the 1770s, nearly 1,000 professional wig makers worked in France alone, crafting pieces that could cost as much as several months' wages for the average worker. And like all great fashion trends, once the aristocrats adopted wigs everyone wanted in, suddenly blacksmiths, merchants, and craftsmen were powdering their hair and strutting like nobles. The elite were horrified. One French noble, the Marquis de Mirabeau, famously lamented meeting a finely dressed man who turned out to be his blacksmith's son. For the aristocracy, the thought of the lower classes mimicking their style was an identity crisis. But the wealthy fought back the only way they knew how, by making their wigs even more elaborate. Jewels, feathers, ships, bird cages. Some women's wigs became so ornate they required support scaffolding just to hold their shape. The story of the powdered wig is one of human ingenuity and vanity. It reveals how fashion evolves not just through art and expression, but through illness, insecurity, and imitation. From concealing disease to commanding attention, the wig became a cultural powerhouse, transforming from a medical necessity into an imperial symbol, and finally into a fashion ghost, hovering forever in portraits, museums, and idioms like bigwig. So, the next time you hear that word or see an old painting of some stately figure in a cloud of white hair, remember that wasn't just a style. It was survival. It was status. It was scandal. And it all started with a patch of missing.